Before we can even begin to talk about the respect that arises when you walk away, we must first understand why it's so hard to leave in the first place. Why do we stay where we're not valued? Why do we keep pouring energy into relationships or situations that drain us? Carl Jung believed that many of our attachments are not entirely conscious decisions. They are often driven by inner complexes, unresolved emotional patterns that quietly dictate our behavior from beneath the surface. These complexes have their roots in childhood wounds, unacknowledged fears, and unmet psychological needs. We're not just clinging to a person or a place. We're clinging to a narrative, a wound we want to heal, a part of our psyche that is still waiting to be seen. At the heart of this unconscious clinging lies a fundamental archetypal fear, the fear of abandonment, of emptiness, of existential solitude. Jung explored how these fears shape our inner world. When we feel the pull to stay in something toxic or unfulfilling, it's rarely about love or loyalty in the pure sense. More often, it's about a deep inner resistance to confront the abyss that would be left behind if we walked away. We fear the silence that would follow. We fear the mirror that solitude would force us to face. Because in that stillness, there are no distractions, only ourselves. And if we haven't integrated our inner world, if we haven't made peace with our shadow, that silence becomes unbearable. Jung's concept of the shadow is key here. The shadow is the part of the psyche that contains everything we deny, suppress, or ignore within ourselves. And here's the twist. Sometimes we stay in relationships not because they nourish us, but because they reflect our shadow back to us in a familiar way. If we carry an internalized sense of unworthiness, we may unconsciously be drawn to people who confirm that feeling. Not because we want to suffer, but because suffering in a familiar way feels safer than facing the unknown. It's not just emotional. It's archetypal. These relationships become symbolic theaters where our inner conflicts play out. When we're unaware of these inner dynamics, we become trapped in cycles. We rationalize our suffering, calling it loyalty, compassion, or perseverance. But Jung would challenge that narrative. He would ask, who in you is choosing to stay? Is it your conscious self, or is it an inner child still hoping to be seen? Is it the adult in you, or is it an old pattern seeking repetition because repetition feels like safety? What's tragic, and so human, is that we often confuse endurance with love. We think staying is noble. We think sacrificing ourselves will earn us value in the eyes of the other. But Jung would say that this is not love. It's a symptom. It's an echo of an unresolved psychic wound that keeps us orbiting around people who were never meant to hold us. When we do this, we are not loving. We are reenacting. And as long as we don't see the pattern owns us. In the unconscious mind, the logic is circular. We seek resolution, but we use the same tools that created the wound in the first place. We try to earn love in places where love must not be earned. We try to be seen by those who cannot even see themselves. And we do all of this while convincing ourselves that we're being strong, that we're doing the right thing. But strength is not staying where you are being diminished. Strength is knowing when to walk away, and why you stayed so long in the first place. So before we can demand respect, we must confront the inner architecture of our attachments. We must ask, what am I really staying for? If the answer is fear or guilt or a sense of invisibility you're trying to reverse, then walking away isn't weakness. It's the first step toward individuation. The journey Jung believed was essential to becoming a whole person. In that journey, walking away is not about rejection. It's about integration. It's about pulling back your projections, reclaiming your worth, and breaking the unconscious contract that said, I will suffer in order to be loved. Because you won't be respected until you respect yourself enough to walk away from where you are not seen. And that begins with understanding what's really keeping you there. To the untrained eye, walking away might appear as a sign of weakness, the abandonment of effort, the failure to endure, or the surrender of love. But through the lens of Carl Jung, it is something entirely different. In the symbolic language of the psyche, walking away can be a sacred act. It is not collapse. It is metamorphosis. Jung saw the act of stepping back not merely as a behavioral decision, but as a psychological threshold, the boundary between who you've been and who you're becoming. To walk away is to disrupt a pattern, and in doing so, you begin to reclaim authorship of your own narrative. In Jungian psychology, the process of individuation is central. It is the journey of becoming one's true self, not the self others expect, or the self that pleases, or the self that conforms, but the authentic self buried beneath social masks and unconscious roles. And sometimes, the individuation process demands that you leave, not as an escape, but as a declaration of sovereignty. When you walk away, especially from a place where your value has been diminished or taken for granted, you are not abandoning the relationship. You are refusing to abandon yourself. This decision has a powerful psychological ripple. Your absence creates a void. And Jung often said that emptiness has its own kind of presence. It forces the other to confront the consequences of what was unacknowledged. The person who once dismissed you now faces silence. And silence has an uncanny ability to amplify truth. Without you continuing to play the same emotional role, the dynamic fractures. There is no longer someone to absorb the projections, to serve as the emotional mirror, to carry the weight of the other's unexamined psyche. The absence becomes a kind of psychic shock, a space in which reflection, or even regret, can occur. Jung believed that relationships often fall into unconscious patterns where individuals become archetypes for each other. The rescuer, the martyr, the betrayer, the victim. These roles feel real, but they're actually projections. By stepping out of the scene, by refusing to keep acting in a play you never consciously agreed to, you shatter the illusion. You break the unconscious script. This isn't punishment. It's transformation. Not just for you, but potentially for the other as well. When you withdraw from an unconscious dynamic, you open the possibility for consciousness to enter. The other person may resist, blame, deny, but they are now left to face the silence of their own shadow. For you, walking away becomes a rite of passage. It's painful, yes, but also purifying. It often involves grieving what never was, the love you hoped for, the respect you deserved, the connection you tried to salvage. But it also clears space within the psyche, space for clarity, space for healing, space for the true self to rise from the ruins of old roles and conditioned attachments. Jung would say that through this process, you are no longer projecting your needs outward in the hope of being completed. You are turning inward, integrating what was fragmented, and stepping more fully into wholeness. And here's the paradox. It is often only after you walk away that others begin to truly see you. Not just miss you, but see you. Because while you stayed, your presence was background noise, expected and overlooked. It is only when that presence becomes absence that its depth becomes apparent. This doesn't always lead to reconciliation, nor should it. But it can lead to respect. And more importantly, it leads to self-respect. Because you chose yourself, not from ego, but from necessity. You withdrew your energy from a system that was consuming you. And in doing so, you restored your psychological center. Jung taught that transformation is never comfortable. It requires rupture. The old must die for the new to be born. Walking away, then, is a form of symbolic death. The death of a false role, of a destructive dynamic, of a version of yourself that stayed small to be accepted. But from this death emerges a deeper life, one in which your choices are no longer dictated by fear or unconscious longing, but by alignment with your inner truth. To walk away is to say, I will no longer be a character in someone else's unconscious drama. I choose presence, even if it means choosing solitude. And from that solitude, something extraordinary begins to grow. A self that no longer begs to be seen, but radiates from within. One of the most painful truths in human relationships is that respect cannot be demanded, and certainly not begged for. Yet many people find themselves locked in this silent desperation, hoping that presence, loyalty, sacrifice, or relentless availability will one day be enough to earn them what they've always wanted: to be seen, to be valued, to be truly respected. But as Carl Jung understood deeply, this kind of dynamic rarely comes from conscious intention. It arises from the hidden corners of the psyche, from the shadow, and from the projections that operate beneath our awareness like invisible strings pulling us toward repetition. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of the psyche where we store all that we cannot or will not face. Our fears, insecurities, needs, wounds, and also, paradoxically, our strengths. When these elements remain unintegrated, they don't disappear. They find their way into our relationships. We unconsciously seek people who will act out our hidden dramas with us over and over again. And one of the most tragic results of this is the dynamic where we try to earn respect from those who are psychologically incapable of offering it. Not because they are evil, but because we are playing roles for each other that neither of us fully understands. Many people stay in relationships where they are ignored, undervalued, or even subtly humiliated. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because there is an unconscious belief that if I stay long enough, give enough, prove myself enough, the other person will finally change. That they will finally give me what I never received. But Jung would say this is not about the other person. This is about a wound, likely rooted in childhood, being projected into the present. We're not interacting with just this partner or this friend or this parent. We are, in a symbolic sense, trying to rewrite the story of our past. This projection is dangerous because it keeps us performing. We become emotional laborers, caretakers of someone else's comfort, hoping that by shrinking ourselves, we'll be rewarded with recognition. But the human psyche doesn't work that way. Respect doesn't grow from overexposure. In fact, the more available you are to someone who refuses to value you, the more they may subconsciously devalue your presence. Why? Because your constant availability removes the need for reflection. It removes the mystery. It removes the very tension that forces the other person to confront your depth. Jung believed that to stop this cycle, one must withdraw the projection. This is not simply pulling away out of anger. It is a deep inner decision to stop playing the role you've been unconsciously cast in. When you walk away from someone who only valued you as long as you were convenient, you're not being cruel. You're stepping out of the psychic play. You're refusing to carry their shadow anymore. And here's where it gets powerful. When you stop playing your role, the entire dynamic collapses. The person is left with their own emptiness, their own unresolved material. And often, that's the first moment they truly see you. But seeing does not always mean returning. And that's important to understand. Walking away and being respected does not guarantee reconciliation. Sometimes the respect that comes after you leave is silent, internal, never spoken aloud. But it exists. Because even people who mistreated you can recognize, often too late, the weight of your absence. Not because you shouted, not because you demanded anything, but because you stopped asking. You left the stage. Jung would say that real respect begins within. When you respect yourself enough to stop tolerating what injures your soul, you become psychologically untouchable. That kind of integrity can't be manipulated, and even the most unaware people feel it. They may not articulate it, but they sense it. The boundary, the self-possession, the refusal to participate in a game that costs your dignity. This is not arrogance. It is shadow work. It is the painful, necessary act of facing your own needs, your own patterns, and choosing differently, not from anger, but from clarity. When you walk away not to punish, but to protect your inner world, you embody the very essence of transformation Jung spoke of. You are no longer a seeker of validation. You become the source of your own. So no, respect cannot be begged. It emerges in the space where self-abandonment ends. It grows in the silence that follows a clean departure. And it lasts not because you insisted on it, but because you finally remembered who you are. In a world that constantly pressures us to adapt, conform, and compromise for the sake of connection, choosing yourself can feel like betrayal, not only of others, but of the very identity you've spent years constructing to belong. Yet Carl Jung taught that this radical return to self is not selfish. It is essential. It is, in fact, a revolutionary act. Because to choose yourself, especially in the face of rejection, manipulation, or subtle invalidation, is to declare that your inner truth is more valuable than social approval. And in doing so, you break the unspoken psychological contract that says, I will abandon myself in exchange for love. Jung's process of individuation isn't just about becoming more self-aware. It's about becoming whole. And wholeness requires confrontation. It demands that you face the parts of yourself you've silenced in order to be accepted. The anger, the sadness, the intuition, the desire to say no. It means realizing how many times you said yes just to keep the peace, how often you bit your tongue, tolerated disrespect, or wore a mask to preserve the illusion of connection. When you choose yourself, you're not just setting boundaries, you're shattering an internal system built on fear. And fear is powerful. Most people don't stay in harmful situations because they're weak. They stay because the fear of being alone, of being seen as too much or not enough, feels more terrifying than the slow erosion of their soul. But Jung would say that to betray yourself in order to be loved is to abandon the very core of the self, the archetypal center of meaning, vitality, and identity. When you choose to leave a space where you're not respected, you're not just walking away from another person. You're walking back to the self. And that return is sacred. There's a quiet revolution in the moment someone says, enough. I will no longer play this role. I will no longer sacrifice my truth to make others comfortable. This isn't an act of violence. It's an act of resurrection. And it's terrifying because it goes against everything we've been taught. We're told that good people stay, that strong people endure, that love means compromise. But Jung invites us to ask, what kind of love demands the death of your authenticity? If you have to disappear in order to be accepted, is that acceptance even real? This is why authenticity, in Jungian terms, is not just personal. It's symbolic. It signals to the unconscious that the time of self-betrayal is over, that the self has awakened, that the shadow has been seen. And when that happens, something extraordinary occurs. You begin to radiate integrity. You are no longer performing. You are no longer negotiating your worth. You become rooted, and others can feel it. Even those who once tried to manipulate or diminish you will sense the shift. You're no longer accessible in the way you were before. Not because you're angry, but because you're whole. Ironically, this is often the exact moment when respect arises. Not because you demanded it, but because you are no longer willing to trade your truth for attention. People feel that. There's a gravity to authenticity that even the most unconscious person cannot fully ignore. You become someone who cannot be used, who cannot be moved by guilt or flattery or fear. And that kind of presence is rare and deeply unsettling to those who benefited from your silence. Jung believed that true transformation requires a confrontation with the self, and choosing yourself is one of the clearest expressions of that confrontation. It means you are no longer a puppet of old wounds or cultural expectations. You have reclaimed your life. And once you do, you begin to attract relationships, situations, and energies that reflect your new alignment. Not perfectly, not immediately, but over time, your outer world begins to mirror your inner world, not the other way around. So what happens when you choose yourself? You lose some things: illusions, dependencies, false peace. But you gain something far more profound: self-respect, clarity, power, freedom. And in the end, even if others never fully understand your choice, they will remember how it made them feel. They will remember your silence, your absence, your refusal to shrink. And in that echo, some will finally recognize who you were all along, not because you stayed, but because you had the courage to walk away. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a true departure. Not the superficial kind, where someone storms off only to return in the same cycle, but the deeper kind, the irreversible absence born from clarity, from self-respect, from the knowing that staying would mean continued self-erasure. Carl Jung understood this silence not as emptiness, but as symbolic space. And in that space, something remarkable happens, not just for the one who leaves, but for the one left behind. It becomes a mirror, a confrontation, a quiet storm that forces the psyche to see what was previously denied. Jung believed that the psyche is built on reflection. We project ourselves onto others, often without realizing it. Our fears, longings, resentments, and desires become invisible threads that bind us to people and dynamics that repeat. And as long as the projection is unbroken, the relationship continues, regardless of how dysfunctional, imbalanced, or painful it may be. But when someone leaves, that projection is shattered. The emotional container disappears, and suddenly, the other is left holding a story that no longer makes sense. This is why absence can be more powerful than presence. In presence, we continue the dance. We keep playing our roles. But in absence, we are forced to face the silence. And the silence speaks. Jung saw this as an alchemical moment, the start of a psychological transformation. For the one who stays, the loss can awaken a confrontation with the self. Why did they leave? What part did I play? What have I refused to see? Not everyone will ask these questions, of course. Some will blame, minimize, or retreat further into denial. But the seed has been planted. And for many, that seed grows, painfully, slowly, but inevitably. And for the one who walks away, the transformation is just as profound, but it takes a different shape. Leaving is never just about walking out the door. It's about walking inward, into the places you avoided while trying to maintain a connection that no longer served you. There is grief in this process. You mourn not just the relationship, but the version of yourself that tolerated less than what you needed. You confront the internalized voices that said, "If I just give a little more, they'll change." You begin to see how much of your identity was built around trying to be enough for someone who could not truly see you. But once that truth settles, there is a kind of rebirth. Jung often spoke of the symbolic death and rebirth process, the shedding of outdated roles, personas, and illusions, so that the authentic self could emerge. The act of walking away is a death. It is the death of your participation in someone else's shadow. The death of the version of you that accepted crumbs, that confused love with loyalty, that believed silence was safer than speaking your truth. And from this death comes new life. Clarity, boundaries, peace. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of alignment. Jung also emphasized that the psyche is always in dialogue with itself. And sometimes, the loudest conversations happen in silence. When you leave a toxic or imbalanced relationship, you don't just exit, you interrupt. You break the cycle. And that interruption ripples through the unconscious like an earthquake. It is a form of psychic resistance, a refusal to keep participating in a system that wounds both people, even if one of them doesn't realize it yet. And because the psyche seeks wholeness, this rupture often becomes the catalyst for healing, even if that healing takes years. In many ways, the legacy of walking away is not the distance itself, it's the transformation it initiates. It's what happens in the space you left behind. Sometimes the other person grows, sometimes they don't. But more importantly, you grow. You stop asking for permission to be seen. You stop waiting for someone else to wake up. You choose yourself, not in a performative self-help slogan kind of way, but in the deep soul-level commitment to no longer abandon who you are. And ironically, that's when you're finally seen, not just by others, but by yourself. That's when the respect comes, not as a reward, but as a reflection of your integrity. You are no longer begging to be recognized, because you have become a person who no longer needs to beg. And even those who once dismissed you may begin to feel the weight of your absence, not because they miss your presence, but because your absence forced them to meet their own. This is the quiet power Carl Jung spoke of, the kind of power that does not shout, but transforms. Walking away is not the end. It is the sacred beginning of a new psychic order, one where you are no longer a projection, no longer a role, no longer a ghost inside someone else's story. You are, finally, yourself.